Frank Lucas didn't defeat the Italian Mafia by starting wars or spilling blood. He didn't march into their territory with guns or threaten their families. Violence was the Mafia's game, and Frank knew that anyone who tried to beat them at it would end up dead or buried in prison. Instead, he chose a method so quiet and so untouchable that the Mafia didn't even realize they were losing until it was already over. Frank Lucas won by understanding systems better than the people who built them. And the system he exploited most brilliantly was the United States military itself. In the late 1960s, New York's heroin trade was tightly controlled by the Italian Mafia. Their real power didn't come from muscle, but from supply. They decided where the heroin came from, how strong it was, and who was allowed to sell it. Dealers in Harlem paid heavy taxes for weak, diluted product, and there was no way around it. Frank Lucas watched this for years. He played his role, stayed quiet, and learned how the game truly worked. What he realized was simple but dangerous. If you controlled the supply, you controlled everything, and the Mafia was just a middleman pretending to be untouchable. Instead of challenging them directly, Frank looked for a path no one else was willing to consider. While other criminals focused on ports, airports, and borders, places crawling with law enforcement, Frank noticed something the government treated as sacred. America was deeply involved in the Vietnam War, and every week the bodies of fallen U.S. soldiers were flown back home. These coffins were sealed, honored, and protected by protocol and emotion. No inspections, no searches, no questions. Opening them would have been seen as disrespectful, even unthinkable. To Frank Lucas, that wasn't a tragedy, it was a blind spot. Frank traveled to Southeast Asia, directly into the heart of the Golden Triangle, where the world's purest heroin was produced. Unlike the Mafia, he didn't rely on middlemen or established criminal networks. He negotiated directly with the source, securing heroin that was nearly pure at a fraction of the cost. Then he connected with low-level U.S. military logistics personnel, not powerful officials, but ordinary men responsible for handling shipments and paperwork. With bribes and silence, he built a pipeline that no criminal organization could match. Heroin was hidden in specially modified military coffins, beneath the bodies of fallen soldiers, and shipped back to the United States under the protection of military honor. The brilliance of the operation was that no one could challenge it without crossing a moral line. Law enforcement could raid ports and monitor airports, but they could not justify opening coffins draped in American flags. Frank Lucas had created the most protected smuggling route in the country, shielded not by violence, but by respect and fear of public outrage. The U.S. military, without knowing it, had become his delivery service, and it made him untouchable. When Frank's product hit the streets of Harlem, everything changed. His heroin, known as Blue Magic, was stronger, cleaner, and cheaper than anything the Mafia could offer. Dealers switched overnight. The Mafia tried intimidation, but threats don't stop a superior supply. They considered violence, but you can't kill an enemy you can't see. Frank hadn't challenged their authority, he had made it irrelevant. Without ever firing a shot at them, he slowly drained their power and took control of the market. For years, Frank Lucas remained invisible. He avoided attention, dressed simply, and let others chase status and fame. He paid his people salaries instead of percentages, turning them into employees rather than partners, reducing betrayal and rebellion. Money flowed in by the millions, and the Mafia was left confused, fighting shadows while Frank ran an empire built on silence and discipline. He wasn't ruling the streets with fear, he was ruling them with logistics. But power only works as long as it stays hidden. Frank broke his own rule when he wanted to be seen. At the Ali versus Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden, he showed up wearing a $50,000 chinchilla coat, sitting in plain view. That single moment of ego caught the attention of a determined detective who realized no legitimate businessman could afford that life. Frank hadn't exposed his operation, but he had exposed himself, and that was enough. Once the government focused on Frank Lucas as a person rather than his pipeline, everything unraveled. They followed the money, the properties, and the people around him. When he was finally arrested and faced with life in prison, Frank made one last calculated move. He told the truth. He exposed corruption within the military supply chain, corrupt law enforcement officers, and criminal networks on all sides. His cooperation led to more than 100 arrests and shook multiple systems at once. Frank Lucas didn't beat the Mafia with violence. He beat them by understanding that real power doesn't shout, threaten, or bleed. Real power hides inside systems, rules, and unspoken agreements that no one dares to question. He didn't fight the government, he hid inside it. And that is what made him so dangerous. Because you can't shoot a system, you can't intimidate a blind spot, and you rarely see it until it's already taken everything from you. After his arrest, many people assumed the story was over. They thought Frank Lucas had finally been defeated, that the system had corrected itself, but the truth was more complicated and far more uncomfortable. When Frank began cooperating with authorities, it exposed something deeper than one man's criminal empire. It revealed how fragile even the most powerful institutions really were. His testimony showed that the problem wasn't just criminals exploiting the system, but how easily the system allowed itself to be used when no one was paying attention. Frank's cooperation sent shockwaves through law enforcement and government agencies. Dozens of officers were arrested. Military personnel were investigated. Entire units were quietly reassigned or dissolved. The public never heard the full details, because admitting how deeply the pipeline had been compromised would have damaged trust in institutions built on honor and discipline. Officially, Frank Lucas was portrayed as an isolated criminal mastermind. Unofficially, many knew he had simply taken advantage of weaknesses that had always been there. When Frank went to prison, the drug trade didn't disappear. It evolved. The methods changed, the players changed, but the lesson remained the same. The streets became louder and more violent because no one replaced Frank's discipline or structure. Where Frank relied on systems and silence, the next generation relied on chaos and brutality. The result was more blood, more attention, and more destruction. In a strange way, Frank's absence made the game uglier. After his release, Frank returned to a world that no longer rewarded patience or intelligence. He lived quietly, far from the power he once controlled. He didn't chase the spotlight, and he rarely spoke publicly, except to repeat one simple truth: violence attracts attention, and attention is what ends everything. By then, his story had already become legend, twisted by movies and rumors, simplified into a tale of ambition and downfall. But the real lesson was never about crime or money. Frank Lucas's life proved that the most dangerous people aren't the ones holding guns. They're the ones who understand how systems work, where the blind spots are, and how human emotion creates protection stronger than any lock or weapon. He showed that respect, fear of backlash, and moral hesitation can be used as shields just as effectively as force. That's why he lasted as long as he did, and that's why his story still makes people uncomfortable. In the end, Frank didn't just expose corruption in the streets, he exposed something much bigger: the illusion of control. Governments, institutions, and organizations like to believe they are unbreakable, but they rely on rules, trust, and assumptions. When someone understands those rules better than the people enforcing them, power quietly changes hands. Frank Lucas didn't overthrow the system. He slipped inside it, used it, and left behind a warning that still matters today. Because the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who attacks the system from the outside. It's the one who understands it so well that the system itself becomes the weapon. Even years later, law enforcement officers who worked case admitted something unsettling. If Frank Lucas had never drawn attention to himself, he might never have been stopped. There was no single piece of evidence that destroyed his operation, no dramatic raid that exposed the full pipeline. What brought him down was human nature, ego, visibility, and the desire to be recognized. The system didn't defeat Frank. Frank defeated himself by forgetting the rules that had kept him invisible. What makes his story so disturbing is that nothing he exploited was hidden or secret. The military honored its dead. The government trusted its paperwork. Society avoided questioning anything wrapped in patriotism and grief. Frank Lucas didn't invent those values. He simply recognized how absolute they were. He understood that people don't just follow rules, they protect them emotionally. And when emotion replaces scrutiny, systems become vulnerable. After Frank's downfall, authorities rushed to patch the holes he exposed. Procedures were changed, oversight increased, inspections became stricter. But those fixes only applied to the methods Frank had already used. The deeper lesson was harder to address, because it wasn't about drugs or crime. It was about how every system has areas that feel off limits. Areas no one wants to question because doing so feels wrong, disrespectful, or dangerous to public trust. That's why Frank Lucas's story refuses to fade. It's not just a gangster legend, it's a mirror. It forces people to confront an uncomfortable reality. The most secure systems are often protected by belief, not force. And belief, once exploited, can be more powerful than any weapon. Frank didn't need to terrorize the Mafia. He didn't need to challenge the government. He let them continue exactly as they were while he quietly used their own rules to his advantage. In the end, Frank Lucas became a warning rather than a hero or a villain. His life showed that power doesn't always come from dominance or brutality, but from patience, observation, and understanding how people think. He proved that when a system is built on trust, honor, and unspoken boundaries, the greatest threat is not someone who breaks the rules, but someone who follows them too well. And that is why his story still matters. Because the next Frank Lucas won't look like a criminal. He won't announce himself. He won't fight the system. He'll study it, respect it, and quietly step into its blind spots. And by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the damage will already be done. The most unsettling part is that Frank Lucas never saw himself as reckless or reckless with lives, but as precise and disciplined. In his own mind, he believed he was minimizing chaos by avoiding violence, by keeping things quiet and controlled. Where others used fear, he used structure. Where others relied on rage, he relied on routine. That mindset is what allowed him to operate for so long, and it's also what makes his story difficult to dismiss as simple criminality. He didn't see himself as a destroyer of systems, but as someone who understood them better than anyone else involved. As years passed, Frank watched the world talk about him without truly understanding him. Movies turned his life into spectacle. Headlines reduced complex decisions into sound bites. What rarely made it into the conversation was the deeper truth. Frank Lucas succeeded because everyone around him assumed certain things were untouchable. Assumptions create comfort, and comfort creates vulnerability. Frank lived in those spaces, never challenging the assumptions openly, only benefiting from them quietly. He often spoke about how noise ruins everything. Loud people get noticed, flashy people get watched, violent people get hunted. The system, he believed, doesn't react to intelligence until intelligence becomes visible. That belief shaped every move he made, from the way he dressed to the way he structured his organization. The chinchilla coat wasn't just a fashion mistake. It was a betrayal of his own philosophy, and it cost him everything. When Frank finally faded from public life, he left behind more than a criminal legacy. He left behind a blueprint for understanding power. Not power as dominance, but power as a line. Meant aligning yourself with forces that already exist and letting them work on your behalf. The Mafia relied on fear. The government relied on trust. Frank relied on observation. And observation, when combined with patience, proved stronger than both. His story forces a final, uncomfortable question. If one man could exploit systems this effectively without violence, without public confrontation, and without immediate detection, how many others are doing the same in different industries, different institutions, and different corners of society? Frank Lucas wasn't an exception. He was an example. And that's why his story doesn't end with his arrest or his death. It continues every time a system is trusted blindly, every time rules are followed without question, and every time people assume power only looks loud and aggressive. Frank Lucas proved that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous because they don't fight the system. They become part of it and let it do the work for them. What makes that realization even more disturbing is how easily people separate morality from structure. Most systems are designed to function smoothly, not to be interrogated constantly. They rely on routine, hierarchy, and trust to keep moving forward. Frank Lucas understood that questioning slows things down, and anything that slows a system becomes inconvenient. So instead of forcing resistance, he positioned himself where resistance never appeared. He didn't need permission. He needed PR, predictability. And the system gave him that freely. Frank also understood something about human psychology that most criminals ignore. People protect what they emotionally invest in. Honor, sacrifice, patriotism, duty, these aren't just ideas, they're shields. The more emotional weight something carries, the less likely it is to be challenged. Frank never disrespected those symbols publicly. He never mocked them. He let others treat them as sacred, knowing that sacred things are rarely inspected. That wasn't cruelty in his mind, it was clarity. As time went on, even his enemies admitted that violence would have been easier to deal with. Violence has patterns. Violence leaves evidence. Violence creates enemies who talk. What Frank built was harder to fight because it blended into everyday operations. There was no dramatic moment where alarms went off, no sudden collapse, just a slow realization that control had quietly shifted hands. By the time the Mafia understood what had happened, the structure they relied on no longer served them. Frank's story also exposes a harsh truth about power dynamics. The people at the top are rarely the ones doing the work that matters most. Systems are carried by the overlooked, the underpaid, and the unnoticed. Frank didn't corrupt the powerful first. He corrupted the invisible. The people no one suspected, no one monitored closely, and no one believed could matter. That wasn't an accident. It was strategy. When everything finally ended, Kay didn't leave behind chaos the way others did. He left behind silence and unanswered questions. Officials moved on. Files were sealed. Conversations stopped. But the unease remained because his story suggested that the real danger wasn't what he did, but how possible it was. If it could happen once, it could happen again, under different names with different methods, hidden inside different systems. That is why Frank Lucas's legacy feels unfinished. Not because he escaped justice, but because he revealed something that justice itself struggles to confront. Laws can punish actions, but they can't easily punish understanding. They can stop criminals, but they can't erase blind spots. Frank didn't invent those blind spots. He simply stepped into them. And as long as systems continue to rely on trust without scrutiny, routine without reflection, and honor without verification, the conditions that allowed Frank Lucas to rise will never fully disappear. His story isn't a warning about crime. It's a warning about comfort. Because the moment a system becomes comfortable with itself is the moment it becomes vulnerable to someone who is paying closer attention than everyone else. Over time, that discomfort turned into a quiet lesson that few people wanted to openly acknowledge. Frank Lucas forced institutions to confront a truth they were built to avoid. No system can survive on trust alone. Trust makes systems efficient, but it also makes them fragile. Frank didn't break rules loudly, or challenge authority directly. He relied on the assumption that authority wouldn't question itself, and in that assumption, he found freedom. What separates Frank from ordinary criminals is that he never chased chaos. Chaos draws eyes. Chaos invites correction. He chased order. He blended into processes that already existed and allowed them to carry him forward. To the system, he wasn't an intruder. He was invisible. That invisibility wasn't accidental. It was earned through patience, discipline, and restraint, qualities rarely associated with crime, but absolutely essential to long-term power. Even after everything was exposed, many of the people involved struggled to accept what had happened. It was easier to blame Frank as a singular evil than to admit the structure itself had weaknesses. That's why his story is often simplified, turned into entertainment instead of examined as a case study. Because once you admit that intelligence and observation can outperform force, you have to rethink how security, authority, and control really work. Frank Lucas never needed to destroy the Mafia publicly. He let them continue believing they were dominant while their foundation quietly eroded. He never needed to confront the government. He relied on its consistency, its routines, and its reluctance to question emotionally charged spaces. In doing so, he demonstrated that the most effective form of control isn't domination, it's alignment. As the years passed and his name faded, from headlines, the lesson he left behind remained unresolved. Systems changed on the surface, but blind spots simply moved elsewhere. New procedures replaced old ones, but the human tendency to trust what feels sacred never disappeared. Frank understood that technology changes, rules change, but psychology doesn't, and psychology is where real leverage lives. That is why his story still echoes, not because of the money he made or the crimes he committed, but because of what he revealed about power itself. Power doesn't always sit at the top. Sometimes it sits quietly inside routines, assumptions, and things no one dares to question. Frank Lucas didn't seize power by force. He borrowed it from the system and returned it only when he was forced to. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. The world didn't stop being vulnerable when Frank Lucas was arrested. It simply moved on, confident once again that it had fixed the problem. But as long as systems rely on trust more than awareness and comfort more than curiosity, someone like Frank Lucas will always be possible, watching, learning, and waiting for the moment when no one is paying attention. Even after Frank Lucas left the public eye, his presence lingered like a shadow over every system he had touched. People didn't see him anymore, but his method, the quiet exploitation of blind spots, remained a blueprint for anyone willing to notice. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't violent, it didn't make headlines in real time, but it worked, and it worked so effectively that those who relied on appearances, fear, or tradition never understood what had happened until much later. Frank Lucas had taught an unspoken lesson. The loudest threats are rarely the most dangerous. The quiet ones are. What Frank understood that few ever do is that the real power in any system isn't the law, the enforcers, or the rules. It's predictability. Systems function because people follow them without question. They trust that certain things will always happen the same way. Frank used that predictability as armor. The military's respect for fallen soldiers, the Mafia's arrogance in their control, the government's blind reliance on procedure, all of it became tools he could manipulate without drawing attention. And manipulation without detection is more powerful than any confrontation. Even as he served time, Frank's mind never stopped working. He analyzed every mistake, every decision, and every advantage he had leveraged. The world outside had caught up to him legally, but he had already proved something few people recognize. Intelligence can buy time, foresight can buy safety, and understanding human systems can buy control in ways force never can. While other criminals sought fame, Frank sought invisibility, and in that invisibility he found ultimate power. By the time he returned to freedom, the streets had changed, the drug trade had evolved, and a new generation of criminals was on the rise. But Frank's lessons were still there, etched into the fabric of how systems respond to human behavior. He demonstrated that influence doesn't require recognition, control doesn't require violence, and success doesn't require approval. It only requires seeing what others refuse to see and acting when no one is looking. Ultimately, Frank Lucas's life forces a question that remains unanswered. If one man could quietly harness the power of institutions, exploit blind spots, and dominate a world built on fear and tradition without firing a shot, how many others have done or are doing the same today? The answer is terrifying because it suggests that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones we chase, watch, or fear. They're the ones who understand the systems better than everyone else and never announce themselves. Because they don't need to. And that is the legacy of Frank Lucas. Not the drugs, not the money, not the movies or the headlines. His legacy is a warning. Power hides in plain sight. Rules can be used against themselves, and the quiet, patient, observant individual can shift the world without anyone ever knowing, until it's already too late. Frank Lucas walked out of prison a changed man, but the lessons of his life were bigger than him. He had tasted the highest levels of power without ever needing to fire a gun at the Mafia, without ever confronting the system openly, and without ever asking anyone for permission. What made him legendary wasn't just the money he made or the empire he controlled. It was the way he used the rules everyone else followed to his advantage. He proved that intelligence, patience, and an understanding of human nature can achieve more than violence ever could. In the years that followed, Frank stayed quiet, teaching younger generations to understand the consequences of ambition, the cost of ego, and the dangers of being seen too loudly. He understood that respect, loyalty, and discretion were more valuable than fame, power, or wealth. The $100,000 he put in Bumpy Johnson's casket wasn't just cash. It was a symbol of foresight, strategy, and respect, the first step in a master class of unseen power. When he passed in 2019 at the age of 88, the world remembered him for the movies, the stories, and the legend. But the real story, the part that doesn't make the headlines, is the adage he lived by. Power hides where you least expect it. Systems can be exploited quietly, and the people who survive the longest are the ones who understand both human nature and institutional blind spots. Frank Lucas didn't just survive. He changed the rules without anyone noticing until he was gone. His life is a reminder that being loud and visible may win attention, but being strategic and invisible wins history. He proved that the greatest power is quiet, calculated, and untouchable, and that even a driver from Harlem, with nothing but observation, intelligence, and patience, can outsmart entire empires. The legend of Frank Lucas isn't just about crime. It's about understanding systems, respecting their weaknesses, and knowing that the smartest move is often the one no one sees coming. And that is how Frank Lucas didn't just beat the Mafia. He beat them with patience, with strategy, and with a system so untouchable that no one, not even the most powerful gangsters, ever knew how truly unstoppable he had become. His story lives on, a blueprint for power in plain sight, and a warning that the quietest people are often the most dangerous of all.